So, it was around the summer of 2011. I was just finished with middle school, getting ready to move into a new home, and was using a lot of my free time to relax and surf the web, play some games, and watch videos on YouTube. It was there that I learned that Bandai announced that a new Gundam series was coming out in Japan. It would become known as Gundam AGE. This time, however, it was actually going to be a joint effort between two companies, Animation Studio Sunrise and Japanese game developer Level 5. The series came about when Level 5 was hired by Sunrise to create a Gundam video game. Level 5's president, Akihiro Hino, was very interested in working with the Gundam franchise and decided to write a plot summary. Bandai ended up seeing the summary and was so impressed by it, they decided to turn it into a full-fledged anime. Another big aspect of Gundam AGE that would make it stand out from the rest of the franchise was that it was going to have a generational style of storytelling where we would follow the events of the series through the perspective of not one, but three different protagonists across half a century of war. At the time, I was genuinely excited to see what Gundam AGE was about, despite some of the disgruntled fans whining about the character designs and complaining about how AGE was gearing towards a younger audience. I could go on and talk about how this complaint holds very little water when looking at the rest of the franchise and realizing that Gundam has always been geared towards young audiences since the very beginning, but that's a topic for another day. Right now the focus is on Gundam AGE itself, so I ended up watching the whole series via fan subs as that was the only way I and many others could have watched it back then. And I was not a big fan of it at all. Gundam AGE ended up being one of the most disappointing Gundam shows I've ever seen, mainly because of how incompetent the writing felt near the end. Several years later, I decided to come back to the series and watched it in full again to see if I changed my mind about it, and for the most part, my opinions on the series haven't really changed since my initial viewing. With the show still fresh in my mind, I think it's finally time I gave it a proper review. You might notice that this video is pretty long, and that is because my approach for Gundam AGE is going to be different from my normal reviews. Normally I try my best to generalize the plot and characters in my anime reviews, but considering Gundam AGE treats each of its gens like they are their own little Gundam series, I will be talking about each gen separately, starting from Gen 1 and ending with Gen 3. So yeah, there is going to be a lot to cover in this one. With all of that said, let's start from humble beginnings with Gen 1. It is the year Advanced Generation 101. Mankind seemed to finally be living in peace in the space colonies and on Earth, though this peace was shattered when a mysterious entity, later given the name Unknown Enemy, or UE for short, attacks and destroys a space colony Angel in an event that would become known as the Day the Angel Fell, and trigger the 100 Years' War. The events of the series begins during a UE attack on another colony named Ovan, where a young boy named Flit Asano watches in horror as his mother is being buried alive by burning debris. Before she dies, she passes something known as the AGE device to her son, which contained blueprints for a powerful weapon from the past, known as a Gundam. Flit would be relocated to the space colony Nora, where he spends the next 7 years building the Gundam, in hopes that one day it will be able to stop the UE. Upon completing the mobile suit, the UE suddenly returns and commences an attack on Nora. Refusing to let his home be destroyed twice, Flit hops on board the Gundam he made to fight off the enemy. After narrowly escaping the destruction of the colony and saving the civilians with the help of the crew members on board the Federation warship Diva, Flit would agree to become a member of the Diva's mobile suit squad. With the help of his close friends Emily and DK, Flit proceeds to pilot the Gundam to get revenge on the UE and becomes a savior to humanity. The first thing I want to talk about regarding AGE is that the premise seems to be going back to basics this time. We have an Earth Federation that is at war with another faction originating in outer space, a surprise attack on a colony, and of course, the Gundam tradition of having the young protagonist step into the titular mech and fighting off the enemy. If you have seen a Gundam series before, a lot of this is pretty standard. Where Gen 1 differs is that while the white base in the original series sometimes received support from the Earth Federation during the war, the Diva crew is basically on their own against the UE, and so they go out of their way to try and recruit help from other places. I also liked how the show tries to make the identity of the UE a secret in the first half of the arc, even if the reveal of their true identity felt unsubtle. Now regarding the pacing in this arc, it was not that good. In fact, it's one of the biggest problems I have with AGE as a whole, as each of the gens are paced as if they are their own full-fledged Gundam show. This wouldn't normally be a problem, except for the fact that all three arcs are much shorter than the average Gundam series. This problem becomes apparent as early as episode 6, when we get to the Fardane sub-arc that takes up a good chunk of Gen 1. I understand that the arc had a point to make about how two opposing sides must come together to fight a common foe, but it just goes on for too long, and considering there is only 15 episodes in Gen 1, you cannot afford to waste a lot of time, as it ends up making the narrative feel rather disjointed. I will go back to the pacing issues when we get to the later gens in the series, as I find that it just gets worse and worse down the line. But as it stands right now, it's not too bad just yet. Moving on to the characters, I thought they were alright. For the most part, they serve their purpose well. Flit is definitely one of the more interesting protagonists in Gundam. Despite being at the young age of 14, he is surprisingly very mature and intelligent, and already has a goal he wants to accomplish, which is to use the Gundam he built from his mother's blueprints to stop the UE from killing any more people and become a savior. He starts off as a fairly normal kid at first, albeit rather serious, but as he goes through his journey, the events that unfolds around him will ultimately cause him to go down a dark path filled with hatred. Kinda like Anakin, but without the cringy dialogue. Emily can be kind of annoying, but you can't really blame her for it, as she cares deeply for Flit and disapproves the idea of him going out to fight in a war. She is seen to be rather active in Gen 1, and tends to ignore common sense just to make sure Flit was alright. I thought she was a decent character. It's just a shame that this will be the only time she will have any kind of relevancy within the show. DK was just kind of there. He doesn't get much to do aside from learning how to be a mobile suit mechanic from Emily's grandfather Vargas. He's harmless to the story, but I do wish that they did more with him. Grudek was a unique captain, mainly because he's not really the captain of the Diva, as he actually performed mutiny on the real captain and his command staff, since they didn't give much of a shit about the people on Nora when they were under attack. Grudek's methods are usually unorthodox, as he tends to break military regulations and even make deals with illegal weapon dealers. The reason he does this is because of his personal hatred for the UE after they killed his family on Angel. While he seems to be doing all of this for his own personal grudge, he is still shown to care for his crew members and even develops a friendship with Flit over their shared tragic history and hatred for the UE. Wolf is already one of my favorite characters in all of AGE. I like this guy. He's a skilled pilot, but is also cocky, laid back, and a massive flirt, especially to the operator Miles. He's a nice contrast to the more serious characters, and only gets better in Gen 2. Desil was a disturbing motherfucker. Even though he is a toddler, he has major bloodlust and disregards human life. Not much else is known about him aside from his association with the UE, but I do think the writers did a splendid job getting me to hate his little guts. The last character I want to talk about before we move on is Yurin, a soft-spoken young girl with special talents. If you haven't guessed, she is a Lala soon to Flit's Amuro, and one of the big catalysts to his downward spiral throughout the series. They first met each other during the attack on Nora, and it was through Yurin that Flit discovers that he has the abilities of an X-Rounder, which is AGE's version of new types. After that, we don't get to see her again until near the end, where she and Flit reunite on a different colony and start to fall in love with each other. Of course, If you know anything about Gundam, you know that these types of relationships usually don't have a happy ending. As a character, Yurin ends up being pretty mediocre in comparison to the rest of the cast, and her relationship with Flit ends up being underdeveloped due to time restraints, which is unfortunate considering how big of a role she would play in his life. That's pretty much all I had to say regarding Gen 1. So far, I think it was a decent start to the series. The narrative seems simple but entertaining, the pacing has issues, but it wasn't anything that couldn't be fixed later on. The characters are decent, Flit's an interesting protagonist, and the ending to episode 15 made me want to see more of it. All in all, I think it succeeds in getting me to check out the rest of the show. So with that out of the way, let's move on to Gen 2. The year is now AG 140, 25 years after the Diva crew and the Gundam succeeded in pushing back the UE in the Earth Sphere. They have now been identified as a nation called Vegan, which was founded by former colonizers of Mars who were left by the Earth Federation to die when a disease known as the Mars disease emerged and killed several of them. They have since made it their mission to return to Earth and claim it as their own. Since the Battle of Ambat, Flit Asano, who is now recognized as the legendary Gundam pilot, rises from the ranks and becomes the commander of the Federation's space stronghold, Big Ring. He also marries his childhood friend Emily and had 2 children. The story of AGE now focuses on Flit's 17-year-old son, Osamu Asuno, whom was given the AGE device by his father in hopes he would continue to fight against the Vegans. During his time in school on the colony Tordia, Osamu would encounter Vegan mobile suits in a skirmish and take up arms in the Gundam his father once piloted to fight back. He would also befriend a new student at school named Zahar Galet, and the two would form a close bond together, though their friendship begins to fall apart during the graduation ceremony when Zahar reveals himself to be a Vegan. A year after discovering the truth about his former friend, Osamu joins the military and gets assigned to the Diva, the very warship his father worked with. It was there that he was given a brand new Gundam conceived by the AGE system, the Gundam AGE 2. Under the mentorship of his mobile suit team Captain Wolf, Osamu must fight his way through the war using his new Gundam and face off against his former friend Zahar, while also struggling with the fact that he is living in the shadows of his father. Gen 2 has a very weird start. It begins much like Gen 1 did, in typical Gundam fashion, but then we get 2 back-to-back time skips, one for the graduation ceremony, and another to show Osamu getting into the military. Considering that Gen 2 has the same length as Gen 1, this was probably done to save some time. While I do like that the stakes appear to be higher in comparison to Gen 1, it does not hide the fact that the pacing has not improved. In fact, it seems to be getting worse. The subplots that started in Gen 1 are either rushed or ended up being irrelevant at this point. Grudek, for example, returns for one episode, just so they could quickly wrap up his subplot and kill him off, and he wasn't even the main focus of the episode. Did I also mention that there is a 3rd time skip towards the end of the gen? It's almost like they didn't have enough time. As for the characters, well, I think they fare better than Gen 1. Many of them are rather mismanaged. Starting off with Flit, he is still one of the more intriguing characters in the story. Since we last saw him as a child, his personality has taken a dark turn. He's strict and stern, has a deep hatred for the Vegans, and shows no mercy to anybody associated with them. Despite this, he is shown to still care for his family, though his role as a commander has caused him to become more and more distant from them as time goes on. His relationship with Osamu is definitely one of the highlights of the arc, but I'll talk about that more when we get to Osamu himself. Wolf is still as badass as ever, and I think he fits the role as captain of the Mobile Suit Squad perfectly. I also really dig his role as a mentor for Osamu, as he tries to teach him that he doesn't need any fancy X-Rounder powers to be a skilled pilot like him or his father. To me, he remains one of the better characters within Gundam AGE, and his tragic send-off is one of the saddest in a modern Gundam series. Next is Malay's Aloy, another returning character from Gen 1. I didn't talk about her previously because there wasn't much to really say about her. Luckily, they did give her a chance to be more interesting by making her the new captain of the Diva. In the beginning, she showed great promise. Unfortunately, the moment Flit shows up, he essentially takes control of the ship, and all of the momentum that Malaise had just basically dies and never comes back. It is a shame, especially since, spoiler alert, she never shows up again after Gen 2. Then we have the Sill, who is a returning villain from the first arc. If you recall, he was the bloodthirsty little kid that ultimately gets Yurin killed and triggers Flit's descent into madness. He was actually rather intimidating despite being a toddler, but now that he is an adult, he just isn't the same. It doesn't help that for a lot of the time, he was a complete afterthought in comparison to Zahart. He does get a second chance at taking down Flit, and even manages to kill another important character in the story, but other than that, he felt like wasted potential. You may have also noticed that many of the side characters from the previous arc, like Largan, Adams, and the people of Ardane, are nowhere to be seen. Again, one of the biggest problems I have with Gundam Age as a whole is the lack of time, which causes many of the side characters to be left in the dust. And we aren't even into Gen 3 yet. Alright, I'm done with the complaints for now. So let's talk about the new characters that were introduced, starting with Asamu, the next protagonist of the story. Despite being older than his father was at the start of his story, Asamu is often rebellious and arrogant, and tries to solve problems by rushing in recklessly as opposed to using his head. His main desire is to be as strong as Flit and Zahart, since they are X-Rounders and he is not, and that inferiority complex often causes him to do irrational things. With the help of his mentor Wolf, however, he ultimately becomes his own person and proves to himself that he can be as good, if not better, than an X-Rounder, and by the end of his story, he becomes a total badass in his own right. Arisa is DK's daughter and a member of the Diva's mobile suit team. Strangely enough, she first meets Asamu when he gets assigned to her squadron. I find this a little weird, since Flit and DK are longtime friends at this point. You would think that they would have met each other during their childhoods or something, but meh, it's a minor nitpick. Arisa is a decent character, but she definitely needs to work on her piloting skills. At least she actually has nice chemistry with Asamu, unlike his actual love interest Romari. Romari is absolutely useless, and offers little to no contribution to the plot whatsoever. The only reason she has any kind of relevance is the fact that she is obviously going to marry Asamu at the end of the arc and give birth to Kyo. They try to play up some kind of love triangle between her, Asamu, and Zahart, but it falls flat on its face considering that they literally spoiled Kyo's character design in the promotional art. And for someone who plays a big role in Asamu's life, they don't get a lot of screen time together either. As for the other MS pilots, Max and Albright, well, Max sucks as a mobile suit pilot, plain and simple, and Albright is by far the most decent pilot besides Wolf and Asamu. I did like his subplot where he forms a romantic relationship with the mechanic Remy. It was actually really cute, and I was hoping they could get together at the end. Tragically, fate had other plans. For the Vegan side of the war, we have Zahart Galet, our official Char clone for Gundam Age, and honestly one of the most unsubtle. Now, I understand that most masked men post Char's counterattack had elements borrowed from Char himself, but they ultimately managed to stand out on their own as characters within their respective series. Zahart does this as well, but the amount of Char references they use make him feel rather shallow. He wears a red uniform, his mobile suits are painted red, he performs the famous Char kick, and even one of the characters points out that his mobile suit is 3 times faster than a regular one. Full Frontal from Unicorn was like this as well, but he was from the Universal Century, and that OVA takes place directly after Char's counterattack, so it actually meant something to those characters. Anyway, Zahart is more reserved compared to most of his Vegan comrades, and shows that he cares for his subordinates. The most defining trait about him is his undying loyalty to the Vegan leader Ezelkant, and will do anything to carry out the plan to make a new home for Vegan on Earth, even if he has to kill Asamu, whom he values his friendship with. He's actually not that bad of a character. Yet, at least. Next we have the Magician 8, which is your typical elite squad of mobile suit pilots that aren't all they crack up to be, and Medel Zant, who serves as the Heart's right hand, and is also eternally loyal to Ezelkant. And that's basically it to him. So far, the Vegans appear to be nothing more than a bunch of cartoonishly evil villains. Even Zahart, who is the most level-headed person in the faction, still kisses up to their almighty Lord Ezelkant. Are we going to have any Vegan character that we can actually sympathize with? Well, we can only find out when we get to Gen 3. So when it comes to most people on the internet, they often say that Gen 2 of Gundam AGE is the best arc in the entire series. While I might be inclined to agree, I can't help but notice all of the problems it has that ultimately begin to add up to something greater. I mean, when you have 3 time skips happen within 15 episodes, you have a serious problem with your pacing. A lot of the characters weren't downright terrible, but many of them remained underdeveloped or poorly explored. The last few episodes were pretty good, probably the best in the whole show, but the ending was incredibly rushed and made little sense when you think about it. Hopefully Gen 3 will be the arc to finally get it right, the one that can fix these issues and redeem the series kind of like how Double Zeta did by its second half. I mean, it can't possibly get worse, right? Right? Let the torture begin. Gen 3 begins in AG 151. Asumu and Romari are now married, and Romari had just given birth to their new child, Kyo. Before they had time to celebrate, however, Asumu had to go on one final mission as an Earth Federation pilot, and leaves to go investigate an old ship. He ends up going missing in action, and all that the search party could find was the AGE device. They ultimately pass it back to Flit, who then passes it on to his grandson, Kyo. 13 years after Asumu went missing, Kyo has grown up, and spends his quality time on Earth with his family and friends. This all changed when the leader of Vegan, Lord Ezelkant, finally reveals himself and declares a full-scale invasion of Earth. During the invasion, Kyo was saved by his aging grandfather Flit, who arrives piloting some type of carrier that Kyo boards. Flit then explains to his grandson that the carrier was actually the core fighter to a brand new Gundam that he had made for him, in hopes he would continue to fight against the Vegans. Kyo will get into the cockpit, commence the docking procedure, and thus the Gundam AGE 3 was born. After fighting off the enemy forces, which included a returning Zahart Gallet, Kyo and Flit come aboard the Diva as it is launched into battle once more. This time, however, the ship is being helmed by a captain and crew that are rather inexperienced, and must acquire that experience fast if they are to survive. Kyo was made a member of the Mobile Suit team, and Flit voluntarily comes out of retirement to get the crew into shape. Along the way, it is revealed that Kyo's father, Asumu, is alive and well, and thus the 3 generations of the Asano family must come together to stop Vegan from achieving its goals and finally put an end to the war. Oh man, there is so much wrong with this arc. So for those who are unaware, Gen 3 of Gundam AGE is considered to be by far, no contest, the worst part of the show. You might think that a lot of that has to do with Kyo being an insufferable brat near the end, and while he does play a role in why it sucks, I think there is much more to it than that. For starters, I feel like the writers were running out of ideas. Like, did we seriously need an episode that was basically a combination of both battles of Jaburo from the original and Zeta? Or how about the need to waste time on a throwaway side character like Gerard Spriggans, as opposed to focusing more on the ExaDB, which was something Gen 3 introduced to finally explore the technology within the world of AGE and explain why Vegan has the advanced technology that it does. Oh, and the Earth Federation is still somehow full of corrupt assholes, despite the fact that Flit supposedly purged them all in Gen 2. But honestly, why even bother at this point? It's not like the show is doing anything with this idea. They're just corrupt for the sake of being corrupt because Gundam tradition, I suppose. The pacing is absolutely broken at this point. There is just so much crap that they try to cram in so little time that none of it ever got the full attention it needed for me to actually care. The narrative has just become a train wreck, plain and simple. And the characters? My god, are they a mess! Surprisingly, Flit still has some of the most interesting character development in the series. Seeing his transformation from a bright young kid to a bitter old man with a strong urge to kill all vegans is rather tragic. The war essentially caused him to become the very thing he wanted to prevent, and I think that's what makes him stand out among other Gundam pilots. It's the fact that he chose a darker path than most is what I find rather fascinating and makes him a prime example of how war can impact a person's life for the worst. Next, we have Asamu, aka Captain Ash, who is now the leader of Basidian, which are a group of space pirates that target members of the Federation that secretly work for Vegan. Apparently, they saved Asamu during his final mission, and he decided to stay with them. And his reasoning for this is because he wanted to keep both sides from going all out on each other, as he believes that not all vegans are as vile as Flick claims they are. A cool idea in theory, but I have two issues with this. One, the only vegan that I can recall Asamu ever having any real contact with is the Heart, and that didn't really turn out well for him, so it's really weird that he would have this view of vegan. And two, why did he decide to leave Romari and Kyo in the dark about this? You would think that he would at least leave a note or some kind of message, but no, he just left them for 13 years to be a pirate. And when he does come back, he doesn't give a solid answer to Kyo as to why he was gone for so long. Yes, Asamu still has his badass moments as a pilot, but his characterization really bugged the fuck out of me throughout this last arc. Sarek was a pretty chill guy. He shows himself to be a competent leader, and managed to hold much of the crew together, even offering advice to the newbie captain Natora. He's alright, but I wish we learned more about him. The same can be said for Albright, who is a returning character from Gen 2. He was basically in the background until towards the end, when they decided to give him about 15 minutes of fame, which is a shame because I thought he was one of the better characters from the previous arc. Shenalua was a wasted character in my eyes. I did like how she had a little bit of a mentor role to Kyo, and tried to get him to unlearn some of the stuff that Flit filled in his head, but due to how fast they killed her off, she was ultimately insignificant. I was surprised that they offed her as quickly as they did, because I really thought that she would stick around until the last 5 episodes. I guess that's what happens when you rush your story at Mach speed. Then we have Captain Natora Anus. Aside from having one of the dumbest names I've ever heard in Gundam, I will admit she wasn't that bad at the start. Having a captain that was green does make for an interesting dynamic on the Diva, and with the right development, she could have been good. The problem is, like Milei's, the moment Flit shows up, he pretty much does all the commanding for her, and she doesn't get any kind of room to grow on her own, adding her to the long list of characters within this show that were terribly managed. Now, I could go on and on about this. Several of the side characters are either completely useless or nowhere to be seen. Emily, Arissa, Milei's, all never to be seen again. Wendy, Unoa, basically half of the Diva crew, all just suck, with little to no redeeming qualities whatsoever. The Vegans don't fare any better. Let's start with Ezocan himself. After being teased throughout the entire series, he finally gets his full debut here. His ultimate plan is revealed and everything. And he's one of the worst Gundam villains I've ever seen. Why do I think this? It's mainly because his real ultimate plan is completely asinine. It basically involves creating constant war in order to conceive a superior race of humans, who will be smart enough to not cause any more wars. Now tell me, how the fuck does that work? How is causing an unnatural selection going to end wars? If anything, it only causes more wars by creating people like Flit and Grudek. Not to mention, none of the Vegans seem to question exactly what Ezocan has planned, and I'm not even sure how he would effectively carry this idea out, because if any of his people find out what he wanted to do, they would most likely kill him. Bottom line, Ezo-Kant is completely delusional, and his plan is mind-blowingly dumb. Next we have Zahart, a character that just completely crashes and burns. You know what's sad about this? Zahart actually seemed like he was the most level-headed of the Vegans, and he actually questions Ezo-Kant on his true motives. I was really hoping that he would end up being the sympathetic character that the Vegans desperately needed, but nope. Even after Ezo-Kant exposes his crazy plan to him, Zahart still agrees to go through with it. This is a complete 180 from the Zahart we got at the start of Gen 3. He goes from being a commander that actually gave a shit about his soldiers to a delusional psychopath that actually believes he's carrying out some kind of will from God and blindly kisses Ezo-Kant's ass despite knowing how batshit insane his plan is. It's Shin Asuka from Gundam Seed Destiny all over again. Zahart will go down as one of the weakest Char clones in the entire franchise. He went from being a soldier that genuinely cared for his comrades to an absolute madman that will sacrifice his own people just to achieve the dreams of his idiotic leader. Fran was Zahart's assistant who joins up with him in the beginning of the arc. At first I found her kinda interesting, as she seemed to have an ulterior motive behind her actions, but all that gets thrown out the window towards the end, and she becomes nothing more than a fangirl that worships the very ground Zahart walks on. Zanode is a cartoon villain, nothing more, nothing less, and Gundam is just another one-dimensional psychopath. This is my main problem with the Vegans. There is not a single character within the Vegans military that you could remotely sympathize with. They do end up having one character within Vegan that is kinda sympathetic, and that would be Lu, a little Vegan girl that suffers from the Mars disease, though I question if I would even consider her a character, as she feels more like a cop-out to make us feel bad for the Vegans. Since her stay in the show is so short, and she has nothing to do with the military, I don't think it really changes things a whole lot, besides turning Kyo into a dumbass. Lu also has an older sibling named Dean, who seemed normal enough, but like most Vegans, he seems to can't get enough of Ezo-Kant's crack, and even decides to become a mobile suit pilot himself. Why? For his sister, I guess? Overall, the Vegans are one of the most one-noted villain factions in Gundam. They appear to be nothing more than a bunch of cultists that are forever loyal to Ezo-Kant, no questions asked. Last but not least, let's talk about Kyo, the third and last protagonist of Gundam AGE. I will admit, he wasn't that bad in the beginning. He was naive about war, which is unsurprising considering he was brought up by his sociopathic grandpa. When he joins the Diva, he does start to understand that war isn't a game and has very real consequences, causing him to take it more seriously, especially after what happens to Shanalua. I think with good writing, Kyo could have been a good protagonist in his own right. However, after he gets kidnapped by the Vegans and willingly gives up his age device to them to let them make their Gundam so he could give medicine to Lu, which, by the way, doesn't cure the Mars disease, it only prolongs it. That's when I knew he was going to become the most insufferable character in the series. I know that Kyo is supposed to be a gentler and kinder protagonist compared to Flit and Asamu, but did they really need him to act like a younger version of Kira? Throughout the remainder of the series, after he gets the Gundam AGE effects, Kyo just constantly babbles on and on to his enemies about how we shouldn't fight anymore, we must understand each other, and all it seems to do is just piss them off even more. Kyo doesn't understand that constantly asking people to conform to peace in the middle of a battlefield does not and will never work. Hell, the people around him even call him out for being a gigantic moron, but he doesn't give a fuck and acts like a hypocritical little shit. I know some people might have brought this up, but he could have been far more tolerable if his character was more like Loran from Turn A. Warn people to stop fighting first, and if they don't comply, then fight back. Not just keep spouting the same nonsense over and over and expecting a different result. Another thing that irritates me about Kyo is how quick he is to defend the Vegans despite all the horrible shit they have done, and even tries to tell Flit off for not giving them a chance. But why should he? Throughout the entire series, they have done nothing but prove Flit right. If we actually had some sympathetic characters within Vegan, besides Lu, then Kyo would actually have a point. But we have already established that that's not the case. It only makes Flit look more justified than Kyo, but we are not even supposed to agree with Flit, as his solution to the problem is as insane as Ezokant's. It's just bad writing all around. Someone was not paying attention when they came up with all this shit. So after all that, I am finally done discussing the story of Age. It was a very rocky ride that just completely fell apart. Gen 1 was okay. It had problems, but nothing too bad just yet. Gen 2 had awesome moments, but it was plagued with pacing issues. And Gen 3 was just a massive shit show that was beyond repair. I do appreciate the story for setting out and doing things to make it stand out from the other shows, but it just wasn't executed well at all, and that is a crying shame. Oh, and the ending sucked too, just so you know. Visually, Gundam Age looks solid for a production from 2011, but I feel it's a bit of a step back from what we got in 00. It still looks good enough. It's bright and colorful, the animation is nice, and the battles were still fun to watch. There is some instances of stock footage, but they are mainly for launching and transformation sequences, so it doesn't bother me that much. The character designs are done by Takuzo Nagono, known for designing the characters in Professor Layton. I always liked Nagono's art style, as it gives off a bit of a retro anime feel, which I think works perfectly for Gundam. The mechanical designs were a joint effort between 3 people: Junya Ishigaki, Kanetake Ebikawa, and Kenji Taraoka. The Earth Federation grunt suits are just meh. They are your standard gym style mobile suits, so I don't have much to say about them. I do like Wolf's customized suits though, especially the G-Bouncer. That thing was badass. The Vegan suits are some of the most uniquely designed mobile suits in Gundam. I really love how they look like an alien race you would see in a JRPG or something. I even like the Gundam Legolas, even though I do find its Vegan visor to be kind of weird looking on it. There is one problem I have with them though, and some people might know what it is. I'm of course talking about the recolors. Now, I understand that Bandai is known for meddling with Gundam shows so they can produce cheap model kits on a brim, but there is no way you can convince me that recolors are the most advanced mobile suits that Gundam Age has to offer. That's even dumber than the rehashed Zeon suits in Seed Destiny. At least in that show, they took time to redesign the suits to make them kind of fit in the world of Seed. Here, they just recolored the suit and slapped it into the show like they just don't care. As for the Gundams themselves, I really like them. One little detail that I found cool about the Gundam's various incarnations was how they mirrored the Gundams from the UC timeline. The Age 1 is obviously the ARC-78, the Age 2 is the Zeta, the Age 3 is the Double Zeta, and the Age FX is the new Gundam. Like the Strike and Impulse from the Seed shows, Age 1, 2, and 3 all had the ability to equip different gear, depending on the combat situations. The Age 1 had the Titus and Spallo forms, which looked badass. The Age 2 only got the double bullet, but it had such a wicked on-screen presence that it doesn't even matter. And the Age 3 had the Fortress and Orbital forms, which are both okay, but the Age 3 itself is probably my least favorite Gundam out of the 4. As for other variants, well, the Age 1 full Glancer was pretty cool, and managed to kick the asses of newer machines, The Darkhound was an awesome variation of the Age 2, and is the first pirate-themed Gundam to show up in an animated series. Sorry, Crossbone. Maybe one day you'll finally get an anime of your own. Then we have the Gundam Age effects. As much as I find Kyo annoying, I do like what this Gundam can do, especially when it activates its burst mode, which reminds me a lot of the VMAX mode from Lasner. Overall, Age had a good presentation. While it doesn't live up to its predecessor, it still looks pleasant on the eyes. The music was alright from what I remember, though I can't recognize a lot of the tracks off the top of my head, besides Flit's theme and Osamu's theme. The opening and endings, on the other hand, were all fantastic in my opinion, with my personal favorite songs being Asue by Galileo Galilei, My World by Spire, Real by Vivid, and Aurora by Aoi Iru. In regards to voice acting, the Japanese version was pretty good. Toshiyuki Toyonaga voices young Flit, and he voiced Mikado in Durarara. As an adult, he is voiced by Kazuhiko Inoue, who is known as the voice of Jared from Zeta, as well as Kakashi from Naruto. Young Osamu is voiced by Takuya Iguchi. I don't know a whole lot about his career, but he would go on to voice Luang, one of the characters from Build Fighters. As an adult, he is voiced by veteran seiyuu Kosuke Toriumi, who played the role of Kiba from Naruto, Flashy Flash from One Punch Man, and Yuri Lowell from Tales of Vesperia. Now there are a lot of returning seiyus from past Gundam shows here. Hiroshi Kamiya, Daisuke Ono, Romi Paku, Hiroki Tochi, Hisao Igawa, Aya Endo. I could go on. A dub does exist for this show, but from what I understand, it was only broadcasted in Singapore, and from what I heard, it was just average. To its credit, it definitely beats out any of the shit dubs that were cranked out in the 90s. To conclude my review of Gundam Age, I just want to say that while my review got incredibly negative, especially during Gen 3, I don't outright hate the show like Seed Destiny. I was just disappointed by it. What I thought was going to be a breath of fresh air for the franchise ultimately ended in disaster. And I'm not the only one that thinks this way. In Japan, Gundam Age ended up being one of the weakest performing shows in the entire franchise. The ratings and sales were a massive step down in comparison to Seed and Double O. So what went wrong here? Well, I do know some of the answers. Level 5 CEO Akihiro Hino was placed in charge of the story of Age. The problem is that he had no experience in writing stories for anime, as he mainly produced video games at his company. So he figured that working on a story to an anime is the same as working on a story to an RPG, and he paced Age as if it was a series of video game cutscenes, which doesn't work because anime and video games are very different in terms of pacing and overall structure. This explains so much why Age's story ended up being a train wreck, but in Hino's defense, he and the staff did try to make it work, and I respect them for that. Gundam Age was an ambitious series, and I respect Sunrise and Level 5 for trying something that was unorthodox for Gundam. If they were to ever have another generational style story and learn from their past mistakes with Age, I would be open to it. As it stands, I can only recommend Gundam Age for those who are hardcore fans or are just very, very curious about it. It was a fun experiment, but it just didn't work out. Final score, 3.5 out of 10.